Hey guys, so I've got some updates. I guess you could say I did a little bit of mining off stream. Okay, sue me. So the first thing I did since the last devlog was I wanted the player to have some way of knowing when their wings were taking damage. So I needed some sort of visual representation of, you know, you're flying too high, your wings are losing HP. Because obviously that number in the corner is not going to be there in the final game. So I decided it would look cool if, as your wings are taking damage, little feathers are falling from your wings. And so I created a feather object. I drew up a couple sprites of feathers just kind of falling in different paths. So what the feather object does is it selects one of those sprites, and then it kind of follows a random path left and right as it consistently moves down. And so whenever the player's up in the top portion of the screen, each time that alarm is going off, each time their wings are taking damage, those feather objects are being created, and it kind of creates this raining feathers effect. I also created a few obstacles. So I created these column sprites, one for the top and one for the bottom. So the idea is some columns are coming up from the bottom part of the screen, some columns are coming down from the top, kind of like the pipes in Flappy Bird. And on the column sprites, I activated 9 slice, which basically breaks up your sprite into 3 rows of 3, and that kind of dictates how the sprite stretches. So for example, if you're making UI boxes or like text boxes for your game, you're gonna activate 9 slice so that they can be resized to any shape or size, and the pixels won't get warped or anything like that. So I activated 9 slice. I set it so that the image would tile, so the middle portion of the column would just repeat the more you stretched it upwards, because what I wanted to do was I wanted these column objects to select a random height when they were created, so that I could have some variation in how tall these obstacles were. So I went into the create event of the column objects, and I set the variable height to a random range between the sprite height and half of the height of the room. I went ahead and added some collision code for the columns, but I ended up actually getting rid of that because I decided I just wanted the columns to instantly kill you if you bump into them, so the collision code wasn't really needed. So instead what I did was I created a new object with a brand new sprite, and basically the idea was that when the player collides with an obstacle or when the player dies, they switch to this object, which does not have any of the movement code or anything like that, and it just falls off the screen. And so this way I didn't have to worry about the collisions and stuff like that. You just hit the pillar and then you're dead. By the way, I do realize now, looking back, technically these are pillars because I guess columns are only like when they're supporting something, and then pillars are freestanding or something like that. I don't know. Or they can be freestanding. I don't know. I don't care. I'm going to call them columns because that's what I put in my game, and I'm not changing it. So this is where I ran into a little bit of trouble. The column objects were giving me a hell of a time. So I was using GameMaker's image Y scale function to manipulate the height of the sprite. So basically that just takes the vertical scale of the sprite and changes it based on whatever number you put in there. And so I was changing the Y scale based on that height variable that I set. And I didn't see a problem with that. That seemed like totally normal to me. So basically this variable height was set. It was between the sprite height and the half the height of the room. And then I was setting the image Y scale to whatever that number was. But then I ran the game, and my columns were freaking stretching across the entire screen. I was looking over my code, I looked over it 50 times, and I was like, nothing looks wrong here, this all makes sense to me. And then I would play the game, and the columns would just be stretching through the freaking ceiling. It was at this point that I started just kind of messing with the numbers. I didn't really have a plan with this, but I just was trying to figure out where the problem was coming from. And so I tried making it negative, I tried dividing it by 2, but I would run the game and it would still just be stretching all the way across the screen. So this was pretty discouraging, I won't lie. But eventually, after a lot of trial and error, I did figure out what the problem was. So basically what was happening was, the way that image Y scale works in GameMaker is it takes the height of the sprite, and whatever number you set image Y scale to is the number that is multiplied by the height of the sprite. You know, if your sprite is 10 pixels tall and you set image Y scale to 5, it's going to stretch it to 50 pixels. So it's just multiplying the height by whatever number you put in there. And so in my monkey brain, I was thinking, okay, whatever number I'm putting in this height variable, that's how many pixels tall my column is going to be. I was setting the image Y scale to a number between the height of the sprite and like half the room height. So if you have a room that's 960 pixels tall, you know, you're multiplying like half of 960 by whatever the sprite height is. So no wonder. I am a firm believer that you don't have to be good at math to be able to make games. I am living proof of that. That being said, it is definitely helpful in times like this. I was probably messing around with this for close to an hour, and I was just not getting anywhere. And if I like just was good at math, I'd be like, oh, obviously it's because this is whatever. So I figured that out. I ended up just having it be a range between like 1 and 4. So the image Y scale was either 1, which is just default sprite height, or at the max it would be the sprite height times 4. And that ended up working fine. Now the weird thing was that the columns coming from the top of the screen were working perfectly fine. And I don't know why or how. They shouldn't be, but they are. So I'm not going to question it until it starts causing problems. That's a problem for future Jack. So I finally had an object that would create a column at a random height, and when the player collided with it, they would die. And that took way longer than it should have, let me just say that. So at this point, I created a game data object to control global variables and just like any game-wide code that I needed to have. So for anyone that doesn't know, a global variable applies to the entire game. So most variables just apply to whatever object they're being set in, but a global variable applies to any object can refer to a global variable, basically. And so the first thing I did in this object was I set 3 global variables. I set 1 for the minimum distance between obstacles, 1 for the maximum distance between obstacles, and a final one for the speed that the obstacles would be moving at. So then I created an alarm in that object that would go off every few seconds, and it would lower the minimum and maximum distance variables, and it would raise the speed variable. So basically, as the game progresses, the obstacles get closer together, they get faster, the game gets harder. So then I created an object that I called obstacle generator, and what this was going to do was it was going to live just off screen to the right. So the way that object worked is it set an alarm for a random number of frames between the minimum distance set in the game data object and the maximum distance. Whenever that alarm runs out, it creates either a top column or a bottom column object, and that column starts to move across the screen towards the player at the speed variable that was set in the game data object. At first, the obstacles were too close together, and at times the player couldn't even get through. So I had to adjust those a little bit, make sure obstacles weren't being created too close together or too far apart. A little bit of space between the obstacles was okay because I was also going to be adding moving enemies and stuff later on. I didn't want obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. Hello?
Hey Jack, do you want to watch Survivor?
Oh yeah, sure.
It's coming. It comes out at.
It's what?
At 8.
Okay, I'll be down soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. I also had to tweak the speed variable a little bit so that the game felt like it was moving at a good pace and speeding up at a good pace too. I didn't want it to get too fast, too quick, but I also didn't want it to kind of drag on. And at this point, it was really starting to come together. Like I was playing the game and it felt like I was playing a game. You know, there were obstacles coming in from the side of the screen, the game was speeding up, and I found myself having fun, which is always a good sign. So the next thing I did was I created a camera object. The idea with the camera object was that the viewport would be set to the X and Y coordinates of the camera object. And the reason I added this object is so I could have like little effects like a camera shake and stuff like that. So I increased the room size a little bit so there was like a 20 pixel buffer on each side of the viewport. And whenever the player collided with a pillar and died, I wanted to have a little bit of a camera shake effect. So the way I did that was I created a script. I called it shake. Pretty fitting name, I thought. And so the shake function had 2 inputs. It was the intensity of the shake and the duration of the shake. The camera object is just being set to a random X and Y coordinate in the vicinity of its origin, basically, with the distance of that point based on the intensity variable. And then I could just drop that function into wherever I wanted a little screen shake and put a number for the intensity and a number for the duration of the shake. I also made it so that when the player object is destroyed, the global speed variable is set to 0. So the horizontal movement of the game stops whenever the player dies. So the next thing I did was I started working on my enemy object. I know, exciting. But not that exciting because at this point it's just a red square that disappears after you shoot it a bunch of times. So there's a long way to go. So my red square started with 10 HP. Every time I got hit with an arrow, the arrow object got destroyed, and the damage that was set by the player object for that arrow was subtracted from the enemy's HP. And then whenever the enemy's HP hits 0, the enemy object is destroyed. So I had to create a variable called hit for the enemy object. I was running into an issue where the arrows were dealing more damage than they were supposed to, and the reason for this was because the collision code was being read every moment that the arrow and the enemy were colliding. So I initialized this hit variable in the create event, setting it to false, and then whenever the arrow collided with the enemy, in that collision event I checked if hit is false, we're setting hit to true, and then we're setting an alarm that will set it back to false in a few frames. And then we're doing all of our dealing damage and all that. And so that just kind of creates like a moment of invincibility, I guess. And to make sure that was working correctly, I created a draw event for the enemy, and I just drew the sprite normally, but then I drew text on top of the sprite just displaying the enemy's HP in the corner so I could see that the damage was being dealt as expected. And at first that was not working. I was getting some weird decimal points and things like that that were confusing, but all I had to do was add a few more frames onto that alarm and it ended up working perfectly. I then took a little bit of a break from working on the enemy object, and I just added some code that would kill the player if they left the room. So if they go off the bottom of the screen or one of the sides, that screen shake effect happens and the game stops. Hello, hello. So then I went back to my enemy object, and I was trying to figure out how I wanted the enemies to move. My first thought was kind of semi-random movement around the screen with a consistent push to the left side of the screen. And so I tried GameMaker's built-in move and collide function to just generate a random point a certain distance away from the enemy. And then at the end of the step event, just set their Y coordinate 1 pixel to the left. And that did not work. So I decided it wasn't worth it, and I just had to move up and down at a consistent pace for now. My plan is to have a bunch of different enemy types that each move in different ways, and some of them will just move up and down, some of them will move left to right. I want some enemies to move a little bit more freely, kind of like following the player, so basically staying on screen until the player kills them, which would necessitate combat a little bit more, because at the moment you could just kind of avoid the enemies. But that's something I'm going to worry about down the line. For now, I have an enemy that steadily moves across the screen along with all the other obstacles and moves up and down at a consistent pace. So it's kind of just a moving obstacle at this point, but that is good enough for now. So then I started working on enemy collisions, and for this I actually had to bring back that collision code I originally wrote for the columns, because I didn't want the player to get stuck inside of the enemy and continue to take damage, which was happening a little bit at first when I first started working on this. So just like with the enemy object, I created a hit variable in the player object that would basically give the player some invincibility frames when they collided with the enemy. And for a little added effect, I went into the player's draw event, and I wrote some quick code that basically says if hit is true and image alpha is 0, set it to 1. If it's 1, set it to 0. And that just gave me a nice flashing effect whenever the hit variable is true. I then made a variable in my player object called hasControl, and what I used this for was to either grant the player control of the character or take it away. So everything in my step event, all the movement code and everything, I put it inside of an if statement that says if hasControl is set to true. So if the player has control, they can do all this stuff. If not, they can't do anything. And I use this variable for whenever the player gets hit. So during those invincibility frames, the player's falling, they don't have control of the character, and also that collision code is not running, so that won't affect their movement in a weird way, because I was running into an issue where they were just kind of consistently getting pushed back by the enemy and it wasn't looking the way I wanted it to. So that hasControl variable kind of cleaned that up a little bit. So at this point I had moving enemies that you could damage and kill, that could also damage and kill you, with some nice knockback and invincibility frame effects and stuff like that, and I was super happy with that. Last thing I did there was I just changed the enemy HP to 5, because 10 felt like a little bit too much, Obviously, later on down the line, I'm going to have enemies with different HP, some higher, some lower. I want to incorporate some enemies that are like one-hit kills just to kind of populate the level. But at this point, I'm feeling pretty satisfied with where my enemies are, so I moved on to creating some items. I wanted the player to be able to repair their wings if they get too damaged, and also to be able to heal their HP. So I had to create two objects, one that would be kind of like a wing health item, and one that would be a player health item. So I decided for the wing health, I would do a bottle of wax, because going back to the Greek myth, the feathers of the wings are all held together with wax. As the wax melts, the wings start to fall apart. So by collecting these bottles of wax throughout the level, you can strengthen your wings. So I made a new sprite for my wax bottle. It ended up being more of a wax jar. I just thought it looked better, and it read a little bit better, being bigger, a little bit easier to see what was going on. And then I created an object for my wax bottle, in which I had a collision event with the player that basically just destroys the bottle and adds 1 to their wing HP. And then if their wing HP is above the maximum, which is 6, it just sets it to 6. Now, I didn't just want these items kind of floating in the void for the player to collect, so I thought that I could put my columns to use a little bit and have items occasionally appear resting on top of one of the columns on the bottom of the screen. And let me tell you, that was harder than it sounds. So I went into my bottom column object, and the first thing I did was I created a variable called item chance. And the idea with this variable was it would basically roll a digital die 1 through 20. So if the number that was generated was between 15 and 20, an item would be created at the Y coordinate of that pillar. And I ended up going back and changing that number to 13, just because 15 felt a little bit too sparse. I wanted a little bit more items, and actually getting it to appear right on the top of that column was a lot harder than I expected it to be. Probably just, again, because I'm bad at math. And I wasn't thinking about it in a way that made sense. But what I ended up doing was setting it to the column's Y coordinate and then subtracting the sprite height from that, and that put it up at the top. Just a little side note, as I was playtesting this with the wax bottles in the game, it's really hard to get them. It is really hard. And I don't know if I want to keep it that hard or if I want to make it a little bit easier. If I'm working on a game and it feels too unforgiving, I always have trouble making it easier because I feel like I don't want to take away the challenge aspect of it, but sometimes, you know, it's a weird line to ride. So we'll see. We'll see what I decide. So the next item I started working on was basically the player's health potion sort of thing. And I decided for the design of this to go with kind of like a classic ancient Greek ceramic pot look. I thought the kind of like dirty brown, orangish colors of these pots was really, really striking. And so I tried to incorporate that sort of color scheme. I was looking at a lot of reference photos, and this one specific one stood out because it was kind of already sort of heart-shaped, and I thought that would be kind of fun to accentuate that heart shape and add some little hearts on the pot as well to indicate that this is for your HP. And so that object was basically the exact same as the wax bottle object, just replenishing HP rather than wing HP, and I decided to set it at 5 HP. So once I was done with the items, I got to work on some little visual effects. I thought when you collide with the wax bottle, it would be fun if there were kind of like clouds of wax or like kind of like a splash effect of wax. And then for the ceramic pot, I wanted some little sparkles to appear by the player when they collide with that one. So I went ahead and I made that wax cloud sprite. The way I do a lot of like particle effects, I know that you can set up like particle generators and stuff in GameMaker. I'm not intelligent enough to do that. I don't know how that works, and I can't be bothered to learn it. Sorry, maybe someday I will. But what I do is I just draw a sprite, basically a circle. Each frame, it kind of breaks apart more and more until it's just little specks. And then whenever I want to do like a cloud or things like that, I generate a few of those in random positions with random image indexes and different image speeds and stuff like that, and it ends up creating a pretty good effect. So I made a new script. I titled it SCR Particles, and I just am storing all of my different little particle effects in this one script. So I have a script for wax that just generates a random number of wax clouds at different speeds, different image indexes, different image alphas, and then I wrote one for the sparkles as well, which does the same thing. So it was day 3 at this point. The last thing I did was just create some folders to keep things organized because it was getting a little unruly, and down the line I'm going to have a lot more objects and sprites and stuff to keep track of. So in my objects folder, I made a player folder, a game folder, an items folder, obstacles, enemies, and I did the same thing in the sprites section. And I called it there for day 3. I'm having a ton of fun working on this game. I'm really excited to get into designing some more characters, some enemies, stuff like that, doing some background art, and figuring out how these bosses are going to work, because I still don't really have a plan for that. I have hope that it'll come to me, but it has not yet. So, yeah, stay tuned for that, I guess. Again, thanks for watching. I'll check in soon, let you guys know how it's going. Alright. Stay frosty. Bye-bye.